Welcome back. I'm Barry Craig. For years in Kentucky, the terms legal, moonshine, still would be a contradiction in terms. That is no longer the case. My guest today is Mike Haney of Barlow, Kentucky, and he makes legal moonshine stills. Welcome to the program.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Let's begin. Obviously, the law has changed to permit doing what you are doing. Tell us about that.
It has somewhat. It is perfectly legal to build stills, to own stills, and to sell stills. And one reason is they are multifunctional. You can distill water with this, so it doesn't have to be used to make alcohol. But on the other side of that, you can get a permit from the state. It's called an ethanol fuel permit. It's actually from the federal government. I said state. And it will allow you to make 10,000 gallons of ethanol a year legally, provided you meet their criteria. They have certain criteria that there's a questionnaire you fill out, send in, and it's about an 8-week process it takes for them to go through that. And then they call and do like a short phone interview with you. And as long as you meet all their criteria for this permit, then you can have your ethanol distiller's permit. Now that permit does state that if you make any alcohol before it can leave your property, it has to be denatured with gasoline or something like that so that it's not fit for human consumption. But you can also get a distilled spirits permit, which a lot of our customers get, which will allow you to legally make a distilled spirit, which is a whiskey, a vodka, a rum, brandy, anything like that. And with the proper permits, you can also sell bottles of alcohol also. So it's just a permit process. There's several you got to have to legally make it and sell it.
The technology of this is very different from the stills I'm familiar with. Just explain how these things, they're incredibly complex looking to me. How do your stills differ from the traditional Kentucky whiskey still?
The traditional Kentucky whiskey stills, most of them were, I think, called coffin still. They're oblong box. They were made of all copper, and there's other reasons than what you might think. They were all made from all copper. The biggest reason is copper at that time was not nearly as expensive as it is today, and it's very easy to work with. You didn't have to have any special tools to work with copper. If you had some type of a heat source, whether it be propane or acetylene, which probably back then it was all propane, and some solder, you can work with copper and build anything you want with just a little bit of knowledge. Today we use stainless for several reasons. One is the cost of the copper. Copper is so expensive. Stainless is the perfect metal for this because stainless steel is 100% not leachable. There's no zincs, no leads, no anything like that can come out of it.
Now, we had talked earlier about some of the more unscrupulous moonshiners in the old days used steel. And of course the zinc would leach into the batch, and they would also use car radiators, which you got lead leaching in there.
Yeah, you had some people back in the day that they were only interested in strictly just selling a product. They weren't interested in safety or anything like that. In our stills today, we incorporate some safety features in them also to try to make it a lot more, just a lot more environment friendly for you to use.
So anybody without any experience could buy one of these things and could make?
Oh yeah, we have everything you need from the ferment buckets to the yeast, and actually with today's technology and the yeast strains that they've developed, all you have to have is sugar, water, and yeast we call turbo yeast, and you can make your first batch. You don't even need grain.
Yeast.
Right.
I like
it's called turbo yeast for a few reasons. It works very fast. It has all the nutrients and everything in the yeast that the yeast need to survive in a high percent alcohol wash, we call it, or mash. Some of your baker's yeast can be used, but they tend to die off at about 8%. If you get 8% alcohol in your mash, it won't go much higher than that. The turbo yeast will go all the way up to 20%. So you can see if you make a 20% wash, 10 gallons, that means 20% of your 10 gallons is alcohol versus 8%. So you come up with a lot more of your product also. But that's all through the technologically advanced, systems they have.
Better living through chemistry.
Right, exactly, exactly. Yeast, as most people know, it is a living organism.
Right.
And so they've got several strains that they've developed over the past that will tolerate high percent alcohol.
Let's compare and contrast just for a minute the old way of making whiskey with your way. Now, the old way, you've got your copper still, and you begin, with water, yeast, and I was told that Fleischmann's was what they used. You've got your corn,
right.
And they particularly favored the corn that had the little sprout coming out of it.
Malted grain.
Malted grain, exactly. And you create the mash, and then that ferments. They call it beer or goop.
Distiller's beer, a lot of people call it. Yeah.
Yes.
Most of them call it beer.
So then take it from there. So we've got the mash barrel, we got it working, we've got our mash, we've got the goop done. Take it from there. Then what would they do with it?
Well, once that beer got finished working, which the way most people judge that was by the taste, because when you first start, it's got a lot of sugar in it, it'll be sweet. When it finishes, it'll be real sour. That means all your sugars turned to alcohol. Then they would just dump that into their still. Most of them had like a furnace type. They had a fire kind of to the side, and they would rock around that with clay and stuff like that, whatever was available to them, and that actually radiated the heat around their boiler. So then that would heat all that up, and everything would start to bubble and work from the heat. What you're doing basically whenever you're distilling is you're separating your alcohol from your water. It's kind of like taking a sponge and squeezing the water out and holding a sponge. If you think about it, water starts to evaporate at 212 degrees. Alcohol will start to evaporate at about 168. The preferred alcohol you're after is about 173. First alcohol that comes off is acetones and a little methanol, stuff like that. The first alcohol that comes off, you can tell by the smell, smells just like fingernail polish remover. And it will take paint off of anything, I promise you.
Is that what they call fusel oil?
Fusels come out at the end, usually at the end of the run. You'll see it get real oily look. If it's running into a jar, you'll see it. You can almost see the oil going in.
Right.
Those are your fusels.
Right.
The first parts that come out are your most volatile, which are poisons. We tell people the best way to figure that is the first 2% of anything you make, just throw it away. It makes a great charcoal lighter or anything like that. It'll burn very well, but it's not something desirable to consume. If you're making fuel, it's perfect. Just leave it all in there, and you can actually put it in your car and run it. I mean,
wow.
It's the same ethanol that is in gas pumps today. There's nothing different.
Yeah. So it would come out of the mash cooker through what they call the gooseneck down to the condenser, which is spinning in water, and then that would of course turn it to liquid.
Right. They call that their worm or flake stand.
Right. Exactly. And then that's basically how it was done.
Basically, all it would do is the alcohol vapor would come off at say 170 degrees, travel down a tube, go to their worm in their flake stand, and the cool water recondensed that back to liquid, which that was pure alcohol when it came out.
Now, I also heard that if you really knew what you were doing, you could tell with the bubbles the proof of it. Or if you couldn't, you get a hydrometer from your auto parts store and do it that way.
That's correct. Your high proof alcohol, you shake it, it'll make really big bubbles and they'll disappear real quick. Lower proof alcohol will make smaller bubbles and they'll linger around a little bit. They don't go away nearly as fast. They call it flashing off. The bubbles will flash off real fast or slow. And so you can actually, if you've been around it enough, you can shake a bottle and you can tell whether it's 100 proof or 180 proof. You know, somebody that says they can tell you if it's 86 proof or 90, probably not, but you can definitely tell the difference between 100 and 180 proof and just by the bubbles,
So then to contrast, how is your operation different from the old way?
Well, one thing we do now is use stainless. Of course, they didn't even have stainless, I don't think, back then, but it is a very good metal for this. Like I said, it doesn't leach out, doesn't give you off any harsh chemicals or anything like that. It's very forgiving. You can beat it up, beat it around. It's a very strong metal, and when you shape it or form it, it really gets a lot of strength in it. Now, the kettle doesn't matter that much. Some of the old timers will tell you that it has to be copper, that it does a lot better. Pretty much my theory is all you're doing in here is heating it up to get the vapors off anyway. You're not overheating it, so all you want to do is get this warm enough the vapors come off. Stainless is widely used in the major distilleries now also for their cookers. Now you have to have copper in the vapor path because copper removes sulfides and some other unwanted chemicals out of your alcohol if you want to consume it, yourself. If you're making strictly fuel, no copper at all is necessary. You can do all stainless. But you have to have some type of copper in the vapor path to make it fit for consumption. And that's, like I said, there's a chemical process that takes place. Our stills also, instead of using fire, which is, you can imagine when you have fire, open flame with 180 proof alcohol, it can be a recipe for disaster.
Yeah. Oh,
So-
stills blew up. Yeah.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So we have come up with a way where we've come up with a kit that goes with our stills, and this is basically a hot water heater element. It's a 5,500 watt element. You can go down to your local Lowe's store if you burn it up and get one to replace it with. And then there's a local company called Arch Environmental we've worked with, and we've had them help us develop a control system, which it runs off of 220 electricity. You can control your amperage here, which controls how hot your element gets. And this can be plugged into your wife's clothes dryer, anything like that. Works off a 30 amp circuit. Any house has a 30 amp 220 circuit in it. So that's made it much, much safer than anything that's ever been around before for somebody who wants to experiment. And we have a lot of customers are actually doomsdayers now. They're preparing for the end of our government, the country to fail or whatever. Their theory is, if they can make alcohol for whether it be for fuel or consumption, they will have something to barter with. Money's going to be no good, and they want to be able to make their own fuel also. You can run a motor off what comes out of that still right there first time.
Now this other one really intrigues me. When you brought it in, I said it looked like a musical instrument. What exactly is that, and how does that work?
That is a plated reflux column, and you're right, it does look like a musical instrument, and we came up with a name for it called the Hillbilly flute. Basically, that is the technology that's in your very large distillation columns, whether it be Maker's Mark, some of your more popular, you go to their distilleries, you'll see these rather large columns with these sight glasses in there.
Right.
And that's what this is. We've come up with a system where it has a series of plates in there. There's a plate below each sight glass. And as that vapor comes up, there's a condenser in the top called a reflux condenser. When that vapor hits the top condenser, it turns it back to a liquid. It fills the plate up. The plate has holes in it. The vapor then comes through the plate, and that vapor, the water cools enough it stays on the plate, but the vapor also gets what little bit of alcohol's left in that water and pulls it out. So that goes through a series of these, which is multi-distillations. The difference, this would be considered an old pot still, which is what most everybody in Kentucky made. And a single run off this pot still, you'll average about 130 proof or 65% alcohol. This still will average 180 proof or 90% alcohol first run. So as you can see, especially if you're trying to make fuel, that's what you want. In about 5 hours, 5.5 hours, you can make almost 3 gallons, give or take, depends on your mash and what kind of yeast you use, of fuel out of the Hillbilly flute still, where with this still, you're gonna have to distill it 3 or 4 times to get anything close to that. So, and this also makes a very good first run consumable product too. What most distilleries do is they proof it back anyway to about 140 proof before they barrel it. So you use either spring water or a very good filtered water to proof that back.
Well, now the old moonshiners told me that as the run goes on, the proof drops, and they would blend it to make, and they'd want to get around 86, 90 proof that way. Well, now most people who buy the stills who are going to make a distilled spirit, is it whiskey that they make?
Most people, a lot of them are going for vodka these days, called a neutral spirit. And to make a legal vodka, it's supposed to be distilled at 95% alcohol. That's about as pure as you can distill it. And the reason that's considered a pure vodka is it's For the most part, totally flavorless at 95%. And then they'll add their flavors. You know, you've seen peach vodka and stuff like that nowadays. Well, that's once they get to that point, then they do that, and some just leave it the way it is. The traditional pot still, the proof it'll start at about 160 proof, and it'll continually drop off. And they call that tempering. When they would take, your alcohol comes off in grades, okay? The first part is what we call the high shots or the 4 shots. That's the part I said you throw away. That's what you don't want. Then you'll get into what's called the heads, and it'll be real sweet smelling, real burn, have a lot of burn. If you rub it on your gum or something, you rub it on your hand, you can smell it. It has a real sweet smell. Then you go to what's called the heart of the run. The heart is the best you're going to get, okay? It smooths out, the sweet smell's gone, the burn's gone. But then as that goes, then you go into what's called tails, which is, some people call it tailings. And that's where you start to get some fusels, and a lot of the flavor comes through with the tails. And so what a lot of the old timers did, they would take that in what they called their proofing barrel, and they would mix certain amounts back to get the flavor they were after for their product. And most of them were known for their product, and everyone had a different flavor. If you keep just the hearts, in my opinion, you come up with the very best you can get. And people ask me, you know, why would you want to make why would you want an artisanal distillery or a small batch distillery versus a huge one? Well, it's kind of like biscuits. Homemade biscuits are a whole lot better than canned biscuits because you take more time, the ingredients you use to make it right. It's the same way with whiskey. Small batches tend to be a lot better.
Now that, of course, is where the art comes in as opposed to the science. So you're talking about the smells and all that.
Right.
And that comes with experience, obviously. So if you buy one of these things, the more you use it, the better you'll get at it.
Yep. The Hillbilly flute still helps you somewhat with that, and I'll explain that. When you start that still, I always tell people as those windows start to bubble, that means your vapors are stacking in that column, with your most volatile vapors being at the top. But it also condenses that a lot. You know, like instead of the vapor just coming through here long and slow, it's keeping it inside here. Well, it's packing your most volatile vapors at the top, and that's what comes off first. That still helps you somewhat make your cuts, is what it's called, when you're dividing your liquors. And most of your artisanal distilleries, they are very good at that, and that's what they prefer, is a reflux type still.
Now, an artisanal distillery, what would that be talking about?
Like we've got several craft distilleries,
Yeah,
same
small
thing, right,
operations
that are using our equipment, and they're doing very well. Trying to think if we have one here in Kentucky. We have them all over the United States. We talk to them all the time. They're very happy with what they're making, and it's just they make small batches. They take their time with what they make. Most of the time, their product's a little more expensive than something you go buy that's a major.
It's like those special reserve whiskeys.
Exactly, right. I was going to say Woodford does a Woodford Reserve. That's a single barrel, smaller batched product. Instead of their 24-hour-a-day run, they've made a batch product, and it's known as a single barrel whiskey.
Yeah.
Most all of your whiskey manufacturers now are doing that, and part of that's to compete with these small-time guys that are open small distilleries, and they're doing their small batches. And like I say, most of the time you can tell it's a lot smoother, just a better product.
Well, it's like Scotch whiskey. Blended Scotch and single malt are very different.
Exactly.
Single malt is, I would suggest, much, much better than that blended stuff.
Much more flavorful,
Much,
right.
absolutely. Well, could you, with this, could you replicate, if that's the word, Irish whiskey, Scotch whiskey, bourbon? You could do it all.
Yes, a lot of people do that. You know, there's regulations to what you make. It's like bourbon. To be called a bourbon, has to be 51% corn.
Absolutely.
It has to be aged in a medium white oak medium charred white oak barrel for, I think, a minimum of 3 years, and it has to be made in Kentucky. Now I know those are 3 stipulations, and I think it has to be barreled at no less than 140 proof. I think those are the 3 main things to making a true Kentucky bourbon whiskey.
Well, now, do people who buy these, do they actually age the whiskey? Because you think of moonshiners, you're trying to get it out, and it's that
the difference in today's distiller and moonshiners. Yeah, they were just wanting to sell products.
Right.
You've got a lot of people now at home. They just really want to make their own whiskey, experiment with recipes and things like that. And we actually have barrels from a 1 liter size up to a 20 liter that have a medium char inside. They're made of white oak, and that's exactly what they do.
How do you char your barrels yourself, or you buy them?
I have a company in Texas that makes them for us, and they char them.
How do they do it?
We went to the Independent Stave Company here. It's in Lebanon, Kentucky this past spring.
Yes.
Now they make the large barrels. They don't make small ones.
Right.
And they're pretty much all made by hand.
Right.
They have these big rings that pull the staves together, and they have different stations that put these rings on here, and then they go into it looks like a big burner in the floor. The barrel goes over the top, and it's pretty scientific. They've got a certain amount of heat, a certain temperature for a certain length of time, and it burns the inside of the barrel.
Yeah.
It is definitely charred.
Yeah. Well, that's another question is when you said medium char, I guess the old days they would have done it with a torch, I suppose.
There wasn't a lot of science to it.
Right.
They would just burn it to where
it looked right, I guess.
Over their time of experience, they would use a very experienced person that made the barrels, and he could pretty well look and get them all the same.
Right.
Nowadays, they do it by time and heat because they have a medium and a dark char. And the dark char will make a lot darker product and bring different flavors out. What the charring does to the wood when you put the alcohol in there, it goes through seasons. It needs to go through seasonal changes, but it brings out vanillas and other flavors out of the wood that are desirable in a whiskey. And the more char, the deeper the alcohol soaks into the barrel, pulls out more flavor, is what it's considered.
Right.
And it'll be a lot darker. Some whiskeys, are darker than others.
Right.
Some are light. That has to do most of the time with the charring of their barrel that they put it in.
Yeah.
Barrels are only used one time for whiskey also.
Exactly.
And then they're done away with. A lot of your Kentucky whiskey makers, they go to Scotland.
They do indeed.
Yep.
I went through the distillery at the Ben Nevis distillery in Fort William, Scotland. Went through the warehouse, and there were a lot of barrels marked Louisville, Kentucky, and various places. And the guy told me, he said they age Scotch in either sherry casks or whiskey barrels, and that gives a different flavor to the Scotch. Obviously, if it's going to be aged in a bourbon barrel or a sherry cask.
Right.
Well, now, do you all also supply recipes for making whiskey, or is that up to the customer?
It's pretty much up to the customer. At one point, I thought about putting some recipes on the website, but they're out there everywhere. You can just go to the web and put in moonshine recipes, and you'll come up with a whole list. So, I thought, well, they can figure that one out on their own. But like I said, with the new yeast we have, we have our own packaged yeast called Hillbilly Stills Turbo Yeast. And
I love that name.
It has directions right on the label of how to mix it up, and how to make it work. And we also have some videos that show how to do it, but it's very simple nowadays.
Yeah. But again, it is simple, but the quality comes with the artistry, and
the
that
quality
takes
comes with the little time, experience, and caring. Anybody can make. Well, let's say most anybody can make cookies or candy. Some people make them really well.
Right.
All
Exactly.
So,
exactly.
It's the same thing.
Exactly.
Depends on how much time and yourself you want to put into it. And really dedicate to it.
I guess let's get down to the nitty gritty. What do these things cost? A range.
This system here is our 13-gallon system with a 3-inch, what we call pot still, and the way it sets is about $650. If you put the electric heating system with it, some people buy these and use fish cookers, open fire, whatever. If you put the electric heating system with it, this goes to about $1,100. That system there we call turnkey micro distillery. We have several micro distilleries that actually use our products and production every day. They run them 7 days a week, normally 8 hours a day. And that system there is $2,100 with the heating system. As you can probably imagine, copper these days is very expensive, and there's a lot of time that goes into that piece of equipment there, man hours in building it.
Did you design these yourself?
Yes, I did. This is pretty much a standard design pot still, okay? This came from a lot of people were using these with beer kegs. And they make a 2-inch that'll clamp right onto the top of a Sankey beer keg, which is what they use most of the time today. Beer kegs are changing also. They're starting to use polymers, get away from their stainless. So they're not as good. So we went with the stainless milk cans.
Right.
And a little larger diameter lid. The larger the diameter, the faster you can run your still. So that makes it a little quicker. This still here all came through a lot of hours and research. Did a lot of research on commercial stills, rectifier columns, how all that worked. And I actually worked with a man from Australia. We Skyped a lot about this, and he built the first one off of our conversations, and it didn't work just right. I made some changes to the ones I were building, and together, in a way, we got it was perfected, let's say. The first ones I built were strictly out of scrap. I went to the scrap yard, bought all my copper scrap because it's so expensive, and didn't know if it would work or not. Kept trying to come up with an idea that a small-time distiller could use to make a very good product without spending $100,000. As we were talking about the permit process a moment ago, the distilled spirit permit. Part of the stipulation on getting that is you have to have your equipment in place at the location you're going to distill when you apply for your permit. Well, that's kind of scary for a lot of people to spend $80,000 to $100,000 on their equipment, then have to apply for your permit, and you're not sure if you'll get it or not. So a lot of people buy from us. It's a very small investment compared to what they would make. Then they go through the permit process. Now, what most of those people have done, they'll come back and buy 2 or 3 more. They like it so much, instead of going ahead and spending big money and getting a larger still, and try to develop their recipe and their customer base that way. Of course, someday they will have to, if they do well, they would have to go to something much larger.
We are almost out of time. Unlike moonshiners of old, you have a website.
I sure do.
What is that?
It's www.hillbillystills.com. And like I said, we consider ourselves a one-stop shop. You can come to our website and we have every item on there you need. All you need when you get through with us is a little sugar and water, and you're good to go. I have instructional videos on there that we go through. My son and I own the business. My son's Matt Haney. Couldn't do it without him, no doubt.
Well, that's a tradition. Old-time moonshiners passed it down through the family.
Right.
Yeah, so that's carrying on a Kentucky tradition.
Right. The funny thing is, my wife is from Nashville, Tennessee, and we kind of laugh about it. Her grandfather was, her great-grandfather was a real big moonshiner at Cheatham County, which is right down by Nashville.
Know where it is.
Her grandfather was the lookout for the still during the day and for the drivers to come pick up the product.
There you go.
And my wife's father was a pastor. So it's kind of funny how things
perfect.
go.
It does. It works out. So.
Yeah.
Well, appreciate you coming. Enjoyed it very much.
Thank you very much for having us. I appreciate being here.
My guest today was Mike Haney. I'm Barry Craig. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.